right, why don't you go and take your Bibles and turn to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16. Mark, chapter 16. We've been going through the Gospel of Mark pretty much verse by verse, but we're only in chapter 5. But for this special Sunday, we're going to go ahead and jump to chapter 16. Hey, kids between the ages of 5 and 10, you are dismissed for Sunday school this morning with Miss Brenda. Kids between the ages of 5 and 10, Sunday school with Miss Brenda. Us big kids, Mark chapter 16. We're going to be looking at verses 1 through 8 in just a moment. And the title of the message is Death, the Gateway to Life. In the old city of Jerusalem stands one of the oldest churches in the world. When Helena, the mother of the Emperor Constantine, went there in Jerusalem around 325 AD, she was searching for ancient Christian sites. And the local Christians took her to the spot where Jesus was crucified, Golgotha, Calvary, and also where his tomb was. And it was still very much held in the memory of the Christian community. But it was in no way obvious to those that would not have eyes to see. But it was remembered by those who had cherished this location for 200 plus years. Jesus was crucified outside the city walls. What you're seeing is a map of Jerusalem in Jesus' time. Here's the Temple Mount. Here's the temple. This is where the Dome of the Rock stands today. The Temple Mount is still there. This is old city Jerusalem. This is David's Jerusalem. This is how big Jerusalem was in David's time. Over time, it expands out to the west. And over here, we have Herod's Jerusalem palace. And here, outside the city gates, is Golgotha or Calvary, and also a tomb, because tombs were always outside the city gates. It was on a main road outside the city walls because the Romans wanted the crucifixion to be a big spectacle. They wanted everyone coming and going to see what was happening as a warning to those who would ever defy Rome. Now, folks coming in and out would have witnessed this happen multiple times. But on this Sunday, when that Resurrection Sunday would have been a change for the whole world. Now, this is around 30 AD. By 70 AD, Rome comes in and destroys Jerusalem because of a Jewish rebellion. By 129 AD, the Emperor Hadrian rebuilds Jerusalem and renames it. It becomes known as Aelia Capitolina. The Jewish people are expelled, and this becomes a traditional Roman city. What was once a quarry and had been turned burial grounds, they decided to do something different with. Go ahead to the next. This is an ancient first century tomb, very much like the one that Jesus would have been laid in. In an attempt to erase the memory of the place of Christ's crucifixion and burial, and to dissuade the Christian pilgrims who often came to Jerusalem to visit this spot, Hadrian built a temple over this area to the goddess Venus around 135 AD. We actually have markings underneath in the foundations of this that show that Christian pilgrims came and put Christian symbols there. Because even though Hadrian had erected a temple there, trying to abolish the memory of the place of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, it was always remembered. About 150 years later, in 313 AD, Constantine made Christianity the national religion of Rome. And in 325 AD, his mother Helena, who becomes known as Saint Helena, as she travels the world finding places that were Christian sites, Constantine decides to resurrect a church over the site. So he destroys the temple to Venus and he builds a church that still stands today over the site. This church stands both over Calvary and the tomb. This is the church as it was in Constantine's time. Here is a basilica over this area that was the tomb of Christ that now has a rotunda built over it, which still stands today. There was an open courtyard, and here's Golgotha, the top of the hill of which Christ was crucified upon. And almost all scholars say that sometimes you get to Jerusalem and to Israel, and they kind of have, oh, this is the site where this happened, or this is the site where that happens. Well, scholars say that it's almost guaranteed that this is indeed the site that where Christ was crucified and buried. Golgotha stood outside in the courtyard, although today, now that is covered also by a building, and here is the worship center. This church, though, would eventually suffer significant damage at the hands of Muslims hundreds of years later. And then there would sort of be a back and forth between Muslims and Christians over the years. Come around the 11th century, the Crusaders would overtake Jerusalem and retake it, and they would restore the church, and they would rebuild what had been destroyed. And so this is the second church that was rebuilt. The Muslims would then retake Jerusalem, and they would hold it for hundreds of years until pretty recent times. And eventually the church would be returned to Christians and restored to its final state. Here is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre today. Here is Golgotha in the area, but you wouldn't recognize it today because it's been so built over. And the tomb of Christ, which doesn't look much like a tomb, but if you visit today on this back wall, you'll go into a little crevice and you'll see first century tombs that are still there, showing that this is indeed an ancient first century burial site. Now, the tomb is as empty today as it was on the day that the women first visited it. Let's go ahead and take a look at Mark 16, 1 through 8, which recounts this visit. It says, oh, this is the rotunda that is now over the tomb of Christ. You can go ahead to the next slide. So this is an image of the church today. Go ahead to the next slide. If you looked real close, you can see the Foisey kids in there. You can see that the city has been built up ever since the first century. So this is what you see, and go ahead to the next slide. And there's the Foiseys over there, standing outside the main entrance. When you come into this door here, directly to your right is a staircase. And what I didn't realize the first time I visited was that when you climb this staircase, you're actually climbing the hill of Golgotha. When you get to the top, you'll be in a room where you'll see people standing in a line, and you'll wonder what they're standing there for. There are stations of the cross on the Via Dolorosa there, but what they're doing is standing in a line in order to be able to reach down and touch the top of the hill of Calvary where the outcrop is. It's a pretty significant thing. So those who will be heading to Israel with me in December, and there's still room if you're interested and you'd like to talk to me about it, we will be climbing this hill together and visiting this site, and it will be quite an amazing experience. Go ahead to the next slide, and let's go ahead and read Mark 16, 1 to 8. It says, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Don't be alarmed, he said. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. The word of the Lord. Because Jesus was crucified on a high holy day, that means it was a Sabbath, but it was a Sabbath during a very special Jewish festival called the Passover. His body was taken down, but they didn't have time to properly bury him, to prepare his body. So in verse 1 it tells us, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, very early on the first day of the week. That's today. That's Sunday. And so the first point is this. I want to talk about why we gather on Sunday morning, not that we have to, but why the early church started to. And I want to talk about us, the church, believers, as a gathered community. Jewish tradition observes Sabbath from Friday night at sundown. That's for them when the new day starts. Sundown begins a new day. So Friday at sundown, they begin Sabbath. And that goes all the way until Saturday at sundown. Now, the early Christian community began gathering on Sunday, which is strange and different. It talks about this, and it gives evidence of this in Acts 20, verse 7, and 1 Corinthians 16, 2. The reason is this: Jesus was resurrected on a Sunday, the first day of the week. And this represents a new beginning, really the beginning of a new creation. In fact, in the early church, they had a theology about something called the eighth day. Remember that creation happened in 6 days. Days 1 through 6, God created. On the seventh day, God rested. So what's this eighth day thing? Well, by Genesis 3, you have the fall and a distorted, broken creation. The eighth day was a symbol of the beginning of a new creation. So the eighth day represents a new beginning. So the early Christians talked about how Jesus was resurrected, not just on the first day of the week, but it's the eighth day of creation, the new restoration, the new creation, the new beginning. Jesus is the reason for our gathering as a community, which is why the early church chose to Resurrection Sunday, the day that Jesus was resurrected, to worship together. Now, many of them still observe Sabbath because remember, it started as a Jewish community. But on Sunday, they witnessed to Jesus' resurrection by gathering together in his name. That's because he's the center of our life and our faith. In some sense, these three women are the first to gather to give their attention to Jesus on a Sunday morning. 2,000 years later, we still gather centered on Jesus on the same Sunday morning, Resurrection Sunday. What happened next gives us the reason why we gather. As a church, we are gathered around hope. As they draw near to the tombs, they begin to wonder about a potential problem. In verse 3, it says, "And they asked each other, 'Who will roll away the stone from the entrance of the tomb?'" Now, if a tomb in the first century, early first century, has a rolling stone, it means it belongs to someone who is very wealthy. And we know that this is a fact because the scripture tells us that the tomb actually belonged to Joseph of Arimathea. It was a family tomb and it was unused, which means it was new. We know that Joseph of Arimathea was very wealthy. Of the over 900 burial tombs found from the Second Temple period, only 6 of them have been discovered with rolling stones, one of which is at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre today. This is another of which I've seen with my own eyes, and I've got to see one more. Now, when they first come to investigate, it's what they find and what they don't find that changes everything. What they found was a man dressed in a white robe, sitting in the tomb area. What they didn't find was Jesus' body. And verse 5 says, "And they were alarmed." Probably because in part, in other scriptures, we find that it's quite obvious that this man in white was actually an angel. So that is a rather disturbing encounter. The second thing is that the body of the one that they love is missing. There are times in life when we desperately need special guidance. We find ourselves in over our heads and overwhelmed, and this is one of those times in Scripture. So God provides a messenger. Did you know that the word angel actually means, it's angelos, and it means messenger? So whenever you see an angel, what you're seeing is a messenger. And the messenger says, yes, he was crucified. But then he says in verse 6, he has risen. And this is a completely new and unexpected reality. And they don't just have to take the messenger's word for it. Jesus is going to meet his disciples in person by the Sea of Galilee. In fact, Jesus will appear to many people at different times, even to a crowd of 500 in the 40 days after his resurrection and before his ascension. But the empty tomb and the witnesses are the reason for our hope. It's why we gather. We are a community that gathers around hope. This is not the final word. Whatever difficult thing that you have faced, whatever loss that you have undergone, it's not the last word. God is redeeming all things, and the resurrection is the beginning and the proof of that promise coming true. The Gospels affirm that life is hard, it's unfair, and it's sometimes agonizing. Too often we find ourselves shut up in a tomb-like darkness, unseeing, unknowing. But none of this is the final word. God is at work in unseen places. The power of restoration is greater than the forces of destruction. Good Friday, Resurrection Sunday. In fact, Paul addresses some folks who are saying, well, Christ, maybe that's just metaphorical that he was raised. Or he was dealing with Sadducees who wanted to believe that Jesus was the Messiah, but they didn't believe in an afterlife. And this is how he responds to them in 1 Corinthians 15, 13 to 15. He says, if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. More than that, we are then found to be false witnesses about God. For we have testified about God that he raised Christ from the dead, but he did not raise him if in fact the dead are not raised. So Paul's saying there is a resurrection, and we are proof of this. We've seen it with our own eyes. When I was a new Christian, maybe 2 years into the faith, some Mormons came knocking at my door. I really didn't know a whole lot about the Bible, but I was pretty zealous about my faith, and I took it as an opportunity to defend my faith, even though I didn't really know what I was doing. And they came in, and they were just some young guys, on their missionary trip. I feel bad for them. I really gave them a hard time that day. They left. They're like, we're going to have our elder come back. But after they left, I was kind of convicted, and I thought, and I'm not trying to bash Mormons at all. I believe that they're sincere, and I believe a lot of them are living great lives in faithfulness and seeking what they believe is true. But I asked myself, and in prayer with God, I said, why did I dismiss this so readily? Like, I believe in the resurrection. I believe Jesus appeared to the disciples. And their story is that Jesus appeared to Joseph Smith in the 1800s here in America. That's what I kind of found hard to believe, right? But I thought, well, everything's possible. Like, what I believe in is pretty crazy. Like, it's pretty amazing. It's kind of out there to those who first heard it. So I prayerfully said, Lord, I don't want to dismiss something. How do I know? But I also want you to guide me. So I wanted to be open, sincerely. New Christian, I'm believing new things for the first time. And in prayer and then adding some research to it, I feel like God gave me some pretty clear answers on this. And I noticed that in the Book of Mormon, at the very beginning, sort of an introduction, it talks about these witnesses who proclaim that what Joseph Smith saw and read and wrote was true. In fact, they wrote a statement that an angel showed them the golden plates. These are golden plates that supposedly an angel gave to Joseph Smith. And then he used these special glasses because it was written in an angelic language. And the glasses were made from the Urim and the Thummim. I don't know if you remember the Urim and the Thummim. They're the stones that the high priest of the Old Testament wore in his vestment. And apparently they could come out and they would roll them. And depending on how they landed, kind of like dice, they would discern a yes or no from God about how to move forward. These are kind of a lost treasure, if you will. Nobody knows what happened to them. Joseph Smith says an angel made spectacles out of them. When he looked through the spectacles, he could read the golden plates, the Book of Mormon, and then translated it into English. And that's how it all came about. The only issue is that there are 27,000 phrases and hundreds of verses verbatim from the King James Version of the Bible. The King James Version is a fine Bible, but it's based on old text and a limited amount of Greek and Hebrew text, and we found that there are some errors in it, that the better manuscripts, now that we have more access, show were kind of a little bit changed. Not big deals, but they're errors. These errors are in the Book of Mormon verbatim from the King James Version, which makes you a little suspect, right? But more telling is this. The three witnesses who testified to seeing the tablets and also hearing God's voice testifying concerning the tablets, all three of them broke away from Joseph Smith and the Mormon Church. They were all executed. It doesn't mention that when you read that in the Book of Mormon. But that's what you would expect when something is founded around a lie. But that's not what happens to those who witness the resurrection of Christ. All the disciples, including Paul, with the exclusion of John, die as martyrs for the faith. John is exiled to the island of Patmos, where he will die as a prisoner. All of them claimed to have seen and experienced the physically resurrected Christ. People don't die for a lie. They walk away like those three witnesses did. And it's not just the Bible that records the deaths of the apostles. In fact, extra-biblical sources testify to some of their executions as well. In fact, Josephus, a Jewish historian of the first century, a contemporary of Paul and Peter, but not a Christian, writes about how James, the brother of Jesus, the author of the book of James, was executed by Rome. Clement of the first century, a disciple of Paul and Peter, knew them personally, talks about their martyrdoms in Rome. Paul being beheaded as a Roman citizen, Peter being crucified upside down because he did not consider himself worthy to be crucified right side up like his Lord. In Philippians 1:21, Paul says, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." Those who saw Christ had complete hope in the resurrected reality. When they were faced with certain death, they didn't say, "I made it all up." They said, "Let Christ be glorified. I know in whom I have believed." They had a hope of a resurrection. And so we are a cruciform community. Paul also says in Galatians 2:20, "I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." To be a cruciform community means that we are shaped by the cross. Paul goes so far as to describe Christ as being crucified and him being crucified with Christ. That means whatever lesser things we were once living for, it's no longer the main motivator for our lives. Identifying with Christ in his letting go of these lesser things, and also in being raised toward what is higher, life with God, that is what is now defining and shaping our lives. We live toward Christ, his vision, his objectives, his redemptive narrative. We live for more than what this world could ever offer us. We seek a greater reality characterized by life with God. Paul says, "Christ lives in me." In verse 8 in our passage today, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Have you ever been shaken simply because something was so incredibly unfamiliar to you? I remember I was 20 years old. I had finished going through a recovery discipleship program. I moved out to Grand Rapids to relocate for a new beginning, a new start in my life. And I was thinking, well, what comes next? So I was out walking and talking with God. I love to go on walks and just talk with God. And I was telling him all my plans. And I said, I think I'm going to go back to school and finish my degree in criminal justice. And I felt, I didn't hear audibly, but I had a very distinctive, clear sense that God said, don't bother. You're going to be in full-time ministry. And I was glad that God had seen me, but I remember tears coming down, and they weren't tears of joy, they were tears of fear. But I don't know what that means. I don't know what that looks like. And it would be a couple of years before I even knew which way to go with that. And there was a temptation for me to choose something else, and because it wasn't what God had for me, something lesser, because it was simply more familiar and felt more safe. We understand what it means to be afraid because we're in an unfamiliar place. We don't know what comes next. We don't know how what we're going through is going to be redeemed or used by God. And that's what these women were dealing with on that day. The disciples didn't know what would come next either. But encountering the resurrected Christ at different times and in different places, they trusted him. They trusted that even an unknown future was better than the empty promise of the temporary present and all that this world might offer. And this is what we place our trust in as well. To be a cruciform community is to let go. It's to die to temporal security. And we can do this because of the certain hope of the resurrection of Christ, which points to something so much greater. Paul says, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no one can fathom what is to come. We begin to taste it now. But when we see him face to face, then we will know even as we are known, beyond our wildest imaginations. The best is yet to come. Jesus is the first fruits and the proof of this, the first to be raised from the dead. This is our hope. This is why we gather. And this is what we're gathered around. Every one of us is connected to each other because of Christ. In my own relationship with my wife, we wouldn't have come together except Christ united us. Christ will continue to unite.